She never imagined that a plastic container of cold leftovers would change her entire life. But it did, and what happened next left an entire family in tears. She walked with her head down, clutching a plastic container filled with leftover food. The night was cold, the wind sharp enough to cut through her thin coat. The city streets seemed endless, stretching on and on beneath flickering streetlights. Her shoes were worn through at the soles. Each step was heavy, but she kept going, because home was not a place. It was a broken shelter at the edge of town, built from cardboard and old blankets. Her name was Emily. She was 21, but hardship had carved lines into her face that made her look years older. Once, she had been a bright college student with a scholarship and a plan. But when her mother died of a sudden illness and her father walked out weeks later, everything collapsed. She became the sole caretaker of her younger brother, Sam, just 13 years old. Her dreams were folded up and put away. Survival became the only goal that mattered. Every day, she worked shifts at Miller's Diner on 5th Street. She cleaned tables, scrubbed floors, and begged her manager for extra hours whenever she could. But tips were rare, and her wages barely covered rent on the tiny room they'd lost months ago anyway. What little she saved, she carried home in plastic containers, leftover food that would become dinner for her brother. This was her reality, night after night, unnoticed, invisible. But what Emily never knew was that on one ordinary night, carrying those same leftovers, her life would collide with someone who could change everything. Across town, a man named Richard was driving home with his son, Michael. Richard was a CEO, wealthy, respected, known throughout the business world for his precision and discipline. Yet his private life was marked by loss. His wife had passed away 6 years earlier, leaving him to raise Michael alone. The boy, now 10, was thoughtful and quietly observant, carrying a gentleness his father sometimes felt he himself had lost long ago. Their car rolled through the dim streets. Richard's mind was elsewhere, replaying a tense meeting from earlier that day. Michael, however, was watching the world pass by through the cold glass of the window, and that was when he saw her. A girl, walking with her head low, cradling a container against her chest as if it held something more valuable than gold. Her pace was slow, her shoulders were hunched. She looked fragile, but unmistakably determined. Michael leaned forward, his small voice cutting through the silence. "Daddy, it's her." Richard glanced up, startled by the urgency in his son's tone. "Who?" "The girl," Michael whispered, eyes locked on Emily through the glass. "The one from the diner. She gave me pie last week even, after I told her I didn't have enough money." "That's her, Dad, that's her." Richard slowed the car. He remembered now his son had mentioned a girl who'd covered his bill with her own tip money one afternoon. A small kindness Richard had barely registered at the time. But seeing her now, walking alone through the cold, the memory took on a different weight entirely. Emily kept walking, unaware that eyes were following her from a slowing car. She turned into a narrow alley, clutching the food tighter against her chest. Richard pulled over. What happened next unfolded like a scene from a film no one had scripted. Richard watched her disappear into the shadows. Something pushed against every calculated instinct he'd built his career on. He opened the car door. Michael followed close behind, his small hand gripping his father's coat sleeve. They stepped into the alley and found not a home, but a makeshift shelter of cardboard and old blankets tucked beside a rusted fence. Emily's brother, Sam, waited there, knees pulled to his chest. His eyes lit up the moment he saw the container. He grabbed it eagerly, too hungry to hide his desperation. Emily smiled faintly at him, though exhaustion pulled hard at her face. She sat beside him, pulling her thin coat tighter against the wind. Richard froze. He had expected hardship, maybe. Not this. 2 children surviving in silence, invisible to a city of millions. Michael whispered again, tugging his father's sleeve. "Daddy, we have to help her." What followed was a quiet clash between instinct and caution. Richard was a man used to contracts and boardrooms, not stepping into the lives of strangers. But Michael's words pierced straight through his hesitation. He thought suddenly of his late wife, who had once told him that wealth meant nothing if it never touched another soul. That night, Richard made his decision. He approached them slowly. Emily looked up, startled, instinctively pulling her brother closer. Her eyes carried both fear and pride. She was not used to kindness, especially from a stranger in an expensive coat standing in her alley. Richard's words were simple. "You helped my son once. Now let me help you." Emily shook her head, pride burning hot in her chest. Despite everything she'd endured, she didn't want pity. But Michael stepped forward and held out his hand to Sam, who looked far too thin for a boy his age. Something pure and wordless passed between the two children, and Emily suddenly understood that sometimes accepting help is its own quiet act of strength. The following weeks reshaped everything. Richard arranged safe housing for Emily and Sam. He helped re-enroll Sam in school, books and uniform included. He offered Emily a real position at his company's cafeteria, not charity, but work, and with it, dignity. Still, the transition wasn't easy. Emily carried years of struggle inside her like a second skin. Some nights she cried quietly, remembering her mother's voice telling her to hold on through storms. She worried about owing too much, about becoming a burden to people who owed her nothing. But every time doubt crept back in, she remembered Michael's smile and the small voice that had once said, "Daddy, it's her." As weeks turned into months, an unspoken truth revealed itself. This was never just about money or opportunity. It was about humanity. Richard saw his own grief reflected in Emily's resilience. He had lost a partner. She had lost both parents. Both had been forced into roles neither of them ever chose: protector, provider, survivor. And in helping her rebuild, Richard began quietly healing pieces of himself too. Sam thrived. For the first time in years, he wore clean clothes, carried real books to school, and spoke about dreams of becoming an engineer someday. Emily returned to evening classes, determined to finish what she'd once been forced to abandon. Her hands, once raw from endless scrubbing, now held pens and textbooks instead. And Michael watched it all unfold with quiet pride, knowing his simple words in a cold car that night had changed not just one life, but three. 2 months later, on a bright spring morning, Emily stood in the company cafeteria, where she now worked serving food with her head held high, no longer carrying leftovers home in a plastic container. She saw Richard and Michael walk in. Sam ran toward them, laughing, carefree for the first time in years. Emily paused, her eyes welling with gratitude. She had once carried scraps through freezing streets. Now she carried hope, and all of it had begun because a little boy looked out of a car window and recognized kindness when he saw it. Life doesn't always give second chances, but sometimes one small act of compassion becomes the thread that stitches a broken life back together. Emily never forgot the hunger, the cold, the nights of quiet despair. But most of all, she never forgot the moment a child's voice cut through the silence of the city. "Daddy, it's her." In the end, Emily's story was never really about wealth, or even about survival. It was about recognition, the moment one human being truly sees another, not as a shadow on the street, but as a soul worth saving. And sometimes that recognition begins with the smallest voice in the room. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below and stay for more stories like this one.